The summer of 2015 was unusually tranquil in the picturesque suburban town of Fairhaven, Ohio. Nestled between sprawling oak trees and carefully manicured lawns, the town seemed like a postcard-perfect retreat for families seeking peace away from the chaos of the city. But beneath the surface of this idyllic community, dark secrets brewed, poised to shatter its fragile calm. Madeline Carter stood at the bay window of her two-story colonial home, staring at the cul-de-sac where neighborhood kids raced their bikes. The laughter and carefree chatter barely registered. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the argument she had with Ethan the night before. The words still echoed, sharp and cutting. "You don't understand what it's like to lose everything," she had snapped at her husband. "I'm trying, Maddie. I'm doing everything I can," Ethan had replied, his voice desperate, but the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed his resolve. Madeline knew the argument wasn't fair. Ethan had been working himself to the bone, trying to rebuild after the disastrous investment that had wiped out their savings. But fairness didn't matter to her anymore. Not when their dream life, their dream marriage, had turned into a suffocating void. Madeline wasn't always like this. Born in the bustling city of Indianapolis, she had grown up watching her single mother work double shifts as a nurse, struggling to keep the lights on. From a young age, she promised herself that she'd escape that life. She dreamed of glamour, luxury, and security, things her childhood never afforded her. And for a while, she had it all. Ethan Carter, the ambitious young tech entrepreneur from Columbus, had swept her off her feet at a corporate gala in 2011. He had been everything she wanted, driven, charming, and bursting with potential. Their whirlwind romance culminated in a lavish wedding, followed by a move to Fairhaven, where Ethan bought her a house she'd only ever seen in magazines. For 3 years, they lived the dream, lavish vacations, designer clothes, and endless champagne toasts. But dreams can crumble in an instant. In late 2014, Ethan had bet everything on a startup deal that promised astronomical returns. Instead, it had drained their finances dry. The mansion still stood, but the life inside was hollow. Ethan poured himself into salvaging his career, working late nights and weekends. Meanwhile, Madeline found herself stranded in a house that felt more like a gilded cage. The once fiery connection they shared had turned to ash, and Madeline's resentment simmered beneath the surface. The neighborhood women envied her life, her beauty, her house, her husband. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't see the cracks forming in the pristine facade. As the clock struck noon, Madeline's phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from a friend about a gala happening in Cleveland next month, a high-profile event she'd reluctantly agreed to attend. Normally, these gatherings were a thrill for her, a chance to mingle with the city's elite. Now, they were just a distraction, a way to escape the monotony. She sighed, pouring herself another glass of wine. Across the room, family photos lined the walls, capturing moments of happiness that felt like a distant memory. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a whisper of guilt stirred, but she drowned it with a long sip. Madeline didn't know it yet, but the cracks in her life were about to split wide open. The autumn of 2011 had been a season of transformation for Madeline Carter, back when she was still Madeline Hargrove. At 28, she was a rising star in Indianapolis's event planning industry, working with some of the city's most prominent elites. Her reputation for orchestrating flawless galas and high-profile fundraisers had earned her a coveted spot among Indianapolis's socialites, even if she wasn't truly one of them. Madeline remembered that particular night vividly. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of leaves and distant wood smoke as she oversaw the final preparations for a tech networking gala at the Conrad Hotel. The lighting was perfect, the champagne chilled, and the jazz quartet played softly in the background. Everything had to be immaculate, it always did. Madeline thrived on this kind of pressure. It wasn't just about the events, it was about the connections. Every handshake, every smile, every subtle nod from a satisfied CEO brought her one step closer to the life she dreamed of, a life far removed from the cramped, dimly lit apartment she grew up in. She was straightening a floral arrangement near the bar when she first saw him. Ethan Carter didn't walk into the room, he strode in, exuding confidence that belied his age. At 21, he was easily one of the youngest people in the room, but there was something magnetic about him. His navy suit was sharp, but not flashy. His demeanor was poised, but approachable. Their eyes met briefly as he scanned the room. Madeline wasn't used to being noticed like that, not by someone like him. She was there to blend into the background, to ensure every detail of the night flowed seamlessly, not to stand out. Yet, Ethan noticed her. It wasn't long before he made his way to the bar where she was finalizing drink orders. "You're the one making all this magic happen, aren't you?" he asked, his tone warm and curious. Madeline turned, momentarily caught off guard. "I suppose you could say that," she replied with a small smile, adjusting her clipboard to regain composure. "You must be one of the tech geniuses everyone's here to meet." "Genius might be a stretch," he said with a laugh. "I'm just trying to make a name for myself." "Ethan Carter." "And you are?" "Madeline Hargrove." "Event planner." "Event planner? You must have nerves of steel to handle all this." He gestured toward the bustling room behind them, filled with powerful men and women networking over expensive cocktails. Madeline chuckled. "More like caffeine and sheer determination." Their conversation flowed naturally, drifting from their work to their ambitions. Ethan spoke passionately about the tech startup he'd founded, a cloud-based software company he was certain would revolutionize the industry. Madeline found his energy infectious. He wasn't like the older, reserved executives she usually encountered. Ethan was young, bold, and full of vision. He reminded her of herself, always looking ahead, always striving. That night marked the beginning of a whirlwind romance. Ethan pursued her with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. He wasn't deterred by their age difference or by her initial hesitations about dating someone so much younger. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Ethan's charm and determination chipped away at Madeline's carefully constructed walls. He saw her not just as the polished, composed professional, but as the woman who craved something more. For the first time, she felt truly understood. By the summer of 2012, they were married. The wedding was a grand affair, a testament to Ethan's growing success. Held in a sprawling countryside estate outside Columbus, the event was nothing short of a fairy tale. Madeline wore a custom-made gown, and Ethan looked every bit the young, ambitious entrepreneur he was. After the wedding, they moved into a stunning colonial-style home in Fairhaven, a quiet suburban town Ethan had chosen to escape the chaos of city life. Madeline had hesitated at first, she thrived on the energy of urban environments, but Ethan convinced her it was the perfect place to start their life together. For a while, it was perfect. Ethan's business took off, bringing in more wealth than they could have imagined. They spent their weekends traveling to Napa Valley, New York City, and even Paris. Madeline embraced her role as a supportive wife, hosting dinner parties for Ethan's clients and basking in the glow of their shared success. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Madeline loved Ethan's ambition, but she began to notice how it consumed him. He worked longer hours, spent more time away, and became more focused on chasing the next big opportunity. At first, she brushed it off. Success required sacrifice, didn't it? Yet, as the months turned into years, Madeline couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the life she had built, the life she thought she wanted, was starting to feel empty. The promises of their early romance now seemed like distant echoes, overshadowed by a growing void neither of them was ready to acknowledge. By the summer of 2015, the cracks in Madeline and Ethan Carter's marriage were no longer invisible. Their once passionate connection had become a strained coexistence, stretched thin by financial hardship, unspoken resentment, and the relentless pursuit of a life they could no longer sustain. The lavish lifestyle that had once defined their relationship was now a painful reminder of their losses. Ethan's ambitious gamble on a promising startup had gone horribly wrong, leaving their savings gutted. The designer handbags and luxury vacations that Madeline had once reveled in were replaced by hushed conversations about unpaid bills and the silent judgment of their neighbors. Ethan threw himself into work, determined to rebuild what they had lost. His days started before dawn and ended long after the sun had set, leaving Madeline to navigate the silence of their once bustling home. The empty halls and meticulously decorated rooms felt like a museum of their former happiness. Madeline often found herself sitting alone at the dining table, staring at her untouched glass of wine. Across from her, Ethan's seat remained empty most nights. When he did come home, their conversations felt rehearsed, as though they were strangers performing the roles of a happy couple. "How was your day?" Ethan would ask, his eyes barely lifting from his laptop. "Fine," she would reply, her voice flat, the weight of her solitude pressing down on her. Madeline wasn't just lonely, she was resentful. She had given up everything for Ethan, her career, her independence, her dreams of building something of her own. And for what? To sit in a house that felt like a prison, waiting for a man who seemed more married to his work than to her? Their arguments, once rare, had become a nightly occurrence. "Do you even care about us anymore?" she snapped one evening, her voice trembling with frustration. Ethan looked up from his spreadsheets, his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm doing this for us, Maddie. Don't you see that? I'm trying to fix what I broke." "You're not fixing anything. You're just running away," she shot back, her words laced with venom. Ethan didn't respond. He simply turned back to his work, his silence cutting deeper than any argument could. The tension between them wasn't just about money. It was about what the money represented: security, success, and the promise of a life they both felt was slipping through their fingers. Madeline's growing resentment wasn't confined to Ethan. She felt suffocated by the expectations of Fairhaven's tight-knit community. The neighborhood women, with their polished smiles and subtle jabs, always seemed to be watching. They envied her beauty and the home she lived in, but they didn't see the cracks behind the pristine facade. To make matters worse, Ethan's family wasn't helping. His parents, Robert and Margaret Carter, were a constant source of tension. "They warned me about you," Ethan admitted one evening during an argument. "My mother said you'd never fit into this life." Madeline's face flushed with anger. "And yet, I'm the one holding everything together while you let it all fall apart." Ethan's younger sister, Anna, was no better. Anna had always been skeptical of Madeline, her sharp observations cutting through any pretense. At a family gathering earlier that year, Anna had pulled Ethan aside. "Something's off with her," Anna whispered, her eyes narrowing as she glanced at Madeline across the room. "I'm just saying, you might want to keep an eye on her." But Ethan dismissed his sister's warnings, chalking them up to jealousy or overprotectiveness. He believed in Madeline, even as their relationship unraveled. Madeline's isolation deepened with each passing day. She found herself yearning for the life she had before Fairhaven, before Ethan, before the weight of expectation crushed her. She missed the thrill of her career, the satisfaction of building something meaningful. But most of all, she missed feeling alive. One afternoon, as she stood at the kitchen sink, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message about an upcoming gala in Cleveland, an event she had reluctantly agreed to attend. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of excitement, an escape from the monotony, a chance to step out of the shadows of her life and into the spotlight, if only for a night. Madeline didn't know it yet, but that decision would set her on a path she couldn't turn back from. The Cleveland Gala was a glittering affair, held in the grand ballroom of the Metropole Hotel. Chandeliers cast warm golden light over the crowd of socialites, entrepreneurs, and philanthropists, all mingling over glasses of champagne. For the first time in months, Madeline Carter felt like herself again, poised, admired, and free from the suffocating monotony of her suburban life. She wasn't supposed to go alone. Ethan had planned to accompany her, but as usual, work had come first. "I can't get away tonight," he had said with a quick kiss on her forehead. "You'll be fine without me, right?" Madeline had smiled and nodded, but inside, the resentment simmered. Arriving alone felt like an admission of failure, a public display that their perfect life was anything but. As the evening unfolded, she worked the room with practiced grace, exchanging pleasantries with strangers and acquaintances alike. But no amount of polite conversation could fill the emptiness gnawing at her. She stood by the bar, swirling the amber liquid in her glass, when she first noticed him. Ryan Miles. He was leaning casually against the counter, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his tie slightly loosened as if he'd just finished a long day of closing deals. His presence was magnetic, commanding attention without effort. Unlike the other men in the room, who wore their wealth like badges of honor, Ryan seemed at ease, untethered by pretense. "Waiting for someone?" he asked, his voice smooth but tinged with curiosity. Madeline hesitated before answering. "Not anymore." He smiled, the kind of smile that felt like an invitation to escape. "Ryan Miles," he introduced himself, extending a hand. "Madeline Carter," she replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, confident, and lingered just long enough to make her pulse quicken. Their conversation flowed effortlessly. Ryan was charming without being overbearing, attentive without being intrusive. He asked about her life, her interests, her dreams, all the things Ethan no longer seemed interested in. Madeline found herself laughing at his jokes, leaning in closer as the evening progressed. By the time the gala wound down, Ryan had offered to walk her to her car. It felt innocent enough, but when they reached the dimly lit parking garage, the air between them shifted. He leaned in, and for a fleeting moment, Madeline considered pulling away. But she didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. What started as a single impulsive act quickly spiraled into something far more destructive. Ryan became a secret she couldn't resist, a dangerous thrill that made her feel alive again. He was attentive, showering her with compliments and expensive gifts, things that reminded her of the life she used to have. Madeline told herself it wasn't serious, just an escape from the monotony. But Ryan had a way of making her feel like the center of the universe, something Ethan hadn't done in years. They met in hidden corners of the city, in hotels and restaurants far from Fairhaven. Each meeting was a carefully orchestrated escape, a temporary reprieve from her crumbling marriage. At first, it felt exhilarating, like she was finally reclaiming a piece of herself that had been lost. But with every passing week, the guilt began to creep in. Then came the revelation. It was a sweltering July afternoon when Madeline stumbled upon a phone call that wasn't meant for her ears. She had been searching for her scarf in Ryan's car when his phone rang. The conversation was brief, but the words were chilling. "Shipments arriving Friday. Make sure everything's clean on your end," the voice on the other line said. Ryan's response was calm, almost rehearsed. "Don't worry. It's handled." Madeline froze. Her heart pounded as she pieced together what she had just heard. Ryan wasn't the charming, successful businessman he had portrayed himself to be. He was involved in something darker, something illegal. For the first time since their affair began, she saw the cracks in his perfect facade. But instead of confronting him, she chose denial. She told herself it wasn't her problem, that whatever he was involved in had nothing to do with her. The thrill of their relationship outweighed the risks, or so she convinced herself. Over the next few weeks, Ryan's grip on her tightened. He became possessive, demanding more of her time and attention. When she hesitated to meet him one evening, he showed up unannounced at her house while Ethan was working late. The danger of the situation thrilled her as much as it terrified her. Madeline began to feel trapped, caught between two lives. On one side was her marriage, a hollow shell of what it once was. On the other was Ryan, a man who offered her excitement but carried the weight of dark secrets she wasn't ready to face. Deep down, Madeline knew she was on the edge of something she couldn't come back from. But instead of pulling back, she leaned further in, unaware that the life she had so carefully constructed was about to implode. The night of September 10, 2015, started like so many others in the Carter household, cold, quiet, and filled with unspoken tension. Ethan was supposed to be working late again, locked in yet another desperate meeting with investors. Madeline, restless and uneasy, poured herself a second glass of wine as she gazed out the window into the darkened streets of Fairhaven. The stillness of the suburban night should have comforted her, but instead, it felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Upstairs, she had left her phone on the dresser, where a series of text messages from Ryan Miles waited unanswered. His words were sweet but insistent, dripping with the kind of charm that had once swept her off her feet. Lately, though, those messages carried an edge of impatience, a demand for her time and attention that was growing harder to ignore. Tonight was different. Ryan had asked her to meet him, but she hesitated. The weight of their affair was beginning to bear down on her, the lines between thrill and danger blurring beyond recognition. Something about Ryan's behavior in recent weeks had unsettled her, the subtle threats in his voice, the way his eyes darkened when she didn't comply with his requests. She took a sip of wine, her mind churning with the consequences of her actions. She hadn't noticed the sound of Ethan's car pulling into the driveway earlier than usual. Ethan stepped into the house, his briefcase clutched tightly in one hand. The dim light from the kitchen cast long shadows across the living room, and for a moment, he stood there, taking in the scene. The wineglass on the counter, the faint scent of Madeline's perfume lingering in the air, it was all so familiar, yet something felt off. He called out, "Maddie?" His voice echoed through the empty space. Upstairs, Madeline heard him and froze. Panic set in as she glanced at her phone, still illuminated with Ryan's messages. She shoved it into the drawer, her heart pounding as she tried to compose herself. "Ethan? I didn't think you'd be home so early," she called down, her voice strained but steady. "I thought I'd surprise you," Ethan said, climbing the stairs. The tension in his voice wasn't lost on her. As he entered the bedroom, Ethan's eyes immediately went to the drawer where she had hastily hidden her phone. The drawer was slightly ajar, a mistake Madeline hadn't noticed in her panic. Ethan's gaze flicked back to her, suspicion darkening his features. "What's going on, Maddie?" he asked, his tone quiet but pointed. "Nothing," she replied too quickly, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I was just having a quiet night." Ethan didn't buy it. His hand reached for the drawer, and before Madeline could stop him, he pulled it open. The phone was there, the messages from Ryan displayed on the screen like an open wound. "Who's Ryan?" Ethan's voice was sharp now, a mix of disbelief and anger. Madeline opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth she had been avoiding for months now hung between them, suffocating and undeniable. Before she could speak, the doorbell rang. The sound sliced through the tension like a knife, startling them both. Madeline's stomach dropped. She knew who it was. Ethan, still holding the phone, strode to the door, his anger fueling his movements. "Stay here," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. As he opened the door, there stood Ryan Miles, his expression confident but edged with something darker. "You've got to be kidding me," Ethan muttered, his jaw tightening as he stared at the man who had just destroyed the last shred of trust in his marriage. "I need to speak to Madeline," Ryan said coolly, ignoring Ethan entirely. Ethan stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Get off my property before I call the police." Ryan smirked, unfazed by the threat. "You don't want to do that, Ethan. Trust me." The veiled warning hung in the air, and Ethan's anger turned to confusion. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The confrontation escalated quickly. Ryan, emboldened by his own recklessness, shoved Ethan aside and stepped into the house. Madeline appeared at the top of the stairs, her face pale as she watched the two men collide. "Ryan, stop," she yelled, her voice breaking. But it was too late. Ryan turned on Ethan, his calm facade cracking to reveal the dangerous man beneath. The two struggled, the scuffle crashing through the living room like a storm. Ethan fought back, but Ryan was stronger, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. "Madeline, call the police," Ethan shouted, his voice desperate as Ryan pinned him to the ground. But Madeline couldn't move. She stood frozen at the top of the stairs, torn between the man she had betrayed and the man who had lured her into his web of lies. In the chaos, Ryan reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. The sight of it sent a shockwave through the room, and Ethan's struggles grew frantic. The knife glinted in the dim light as Ryan raised it, his intentions clear. "You should have stayed out of this, Ethan," he snarled. At that moment, Madeline's paralysis broke. She ran down the stairs, screaming for Ryan to stop, but her voice was drowned out by the violence unfolding before her. The life she had so carefully constructed was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The struggle in the Carter living room escalated into chaos as Ryan pinned Ethan to the ground, the glint of the knife in his hand sending a wave of cold terror through Madeline. She stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her mind racing but unable to act. The pristine, orderly world she had constructed was now a scene of destruction, a shattered wine glass glinting on the floor, furniture overturned in the fray, and two men locked in a deadly struggle. "Ryan, stop!" Madeline screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. Ethan twisted beneath Ryan, trying to gain leverage, his face contorted with pain and fear. "Call the police," he shouted, but Madeline hesitated. She glanced at her phone lying discarded on the kitchen counter, the decision to act weighing heavily on her. Ryan glanced over his shoulder at Madeline, his face darkened with fury. "Don't even think about it," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Madeline felt the full weight of her choices. She had invited this chaos into their lives, into their home, and now it was spiraling out of control. But something inside her snapped. Ignoring Ryan's threat, she lunged for the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed 911. The operator's voice crackled through the line. 911, what's your emergency? There's an intruder in my house, he's attacking my husband. Please, send help. Madeline's voice was frantic, her words tumbling out in a rush. The operator responded calmly, officers are on their way. Stay on the line. But Madeline didn't stay on the line. She dropped the phone and turned back toward the living room just as Ryan's patience snapped. He brought the knife down in a sharp arc, aiming for Ethan's chest. At the last second, Ethan twisted, and the blade sliced into his shoulder instead. He cried out in pain, blood soaking through his shirt. "Ryan, stop this. You're going to kill him." Madeline pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Ryan rose to his feet, his chest heaving, his gaze wild. "You think I care? He's the problem, Madeline. He's always been the problem." The sound of sirens pierced the tense silence, growing louder with each passing second. Ryan's head snapped toward the window, his expression shifting from rage to panic. "You called them," he hissed, his eyes narrowing on Madeline. Her heart pounded in her chest as Ryan advanced toward her, his bloodied knife still in hand. "I had to," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. The sirens screeched to a halt outside the house. Red and blue lights illuminated the darkened street, reflecting off the windows in sharp, flashing bursts. Officers spilled out of their cars, guns drawn, their voices ringing out in urgent commands. "This is the police. Step outside with your hands up." Ryan's jaw tightened. He spun toward Ethan, who lay slumped on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but then he turned his gaze back to Madeline, a cruel smirk curling his lips. "You think they can save you from this?" he spat. Before anyone could react, Ryan lunged toward the front door, yanking it open. The officers outside shouted for him to freeze, but he ignored them, raising the knife in a reckless, desperate act of defiance. A single gunshot echoed through the quiet suburban street, then another. Ryan staggered, the knife slipping from his hand as he crumpled to the ground on the front porch. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and glistening under the harsh glow of the police lights. Inside, the house was eerily silent except for the labored breathing of Ethan and the muffled sobs of Madeline. Officers entered cautiously, their weapons still drawn as they surveyed the scene. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" one of them asked, his voice steady but urgent. Madeline shook her head, her legs giving out as she collapsed onto the staircase. "It's my husband," she managed, pointing toward Ethan. "He's hurt, he needs help." Paramedics rushed in moments later, tending to Ethan's wound and stabilizing him for transport. Madeline watched in a daze as they lifted him onto a stretcher, her hands trembling as she clutched the banister for support. As the paramedics wheeled Ethan out, an officer approached Madeline. "We'll need you to come with us, ma'am," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Madeline nodded numbly, her mind racing with the events of the past hour. She followed the officer outside, where Ryan's lifeless body lay sprawled on the porch. The man who had once made her feel alive now lay motionless, a grim testament to the choices that had brought her to this moment. The quiet of Fairhaven was shattered, replaced by the hum of emergency vehicles and the murmurs of curious neighbors peeking through their blinds. For Madeline, the storm had finally come, and there would be no going back. The quiet of Fairhaven returned slowly after the chaos of that fateful night, but for Madeline Carter, the peace was an illusion. The once picturesque home she had so carefully decorated was now a grim reminder of the destruction she had unleashed. Bloodstains had been scrubbed from the floor, shattered glass swept away, and the furniture righted, but no amount of cleaning could erase the memories burned into those walls. Ethan spent weeks in the hospital recovering from the stab wound Ryan had inflicted. The physical pain was manageable, but the emotional scars ran far deeper. The betrayal by the woman he had loved, the near-death experience, and the violent confrontation had left him hollow. He refused to speak to Madeline. The last words she had heard from him that night were muttered between clenched teeth as paramedics wheeled him out, "I don't want to see you again." Madeline stayed away, not because of his words, but because she knew she couldn't face him. She had been the architect of their downfall. The silence between them spoke louder than any argument they'd ever had. By the time Ethan was discharged, he had already filed for divorce. Ethan left Fairhaven shortly afterward, moving to Cincinnati to start over. He sold the house, wanting nothing to do with the memories it carried. His focus turned inward, on healing, rebuilding, and escaping the shadow of a marriage that had once felt like a fairy tale but ended as a nightmare. For Madeline, there was no escape. Within hours of the police's arrival that night, she was placed under arrest. The charges were severe: accessory to assault, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit murder. Prosecutors argued that she had not only allowed Ryan into their lives but had also actively facilitated his access to their home. The media descended on the story, dubbing her the desperate housewife of Fairhaven. Photos of her glamorous life surfaced alongside salacious headlines detailing her affair and Ryan's criminal history. Neighbors whispered about her, some feigning shock, others quietly satisfied to see her life unravel. Madeline sat in a cold interrogation room, the harsh light above reflecting the weight of her choices. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered when questioned. But her words rang hollow even to her own ears. Intentions didn't matter anymore, only the consequences did. By March 2016, the case had become a media spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters and onlookers, eager to witness the dramatic downfall of a woman who had once seemed to have it all. The prosecution painted Madeline as a selfish, manipulative woman who had knowingly brought a dangerous criminal into her home. They emphasized the role her decisions played in the death of Officer Daniel Hayes, who was shot during the confrontation with Ryan. The defense attempted to frame Madeline as a victim of Ryan's manipulation, of a crumbling marriage, of her own desperation. But the jury saw through the narrative. The evidence was damning: text messages with Ryan detailing their affair, receipts for gifts he had given her, and neighbors' testimony about his frequent, secretive visits. After just 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Madeline broke down in the courtroom as the sentence was read. She glanced toward the back of the room, hoping for a glimpse of Ethan, but he wasn't there. He hadn't attended any part of the trial. For him, this chapter was already closed. Madeline's fall from grace left scars not just on her family but on the entire community. Fairhaven, once known for its tranquil streets and tight-knit neighbors, became infamous as the site of the scandal. The Carter home stood vacant for months, a stark reminder of the events that had shattered the illusion of perfection in their idyllic suburb. For Ethan, moving forward was a slow and painful process. He remarried in 2018, finding solace in a quieter life with someone who valued his presence over his success. But even in moments of happiness, the shadow of Madeline lingered. Trust did not come easily anymore. Madeline, now inmate number 41679, spent her days in the monotony of prison life, reflecting on the choices that had led her there. She often replayed the sequence of events in her mind, searching for the moment where it had all gone wrong. Was it the first kiss with Ryan? The night she chose to lie to Ethan? Or was it years earlier, when she had decided that her happiness could only come from the illusion of perfection? The people of Fairhaven, and the country at large, were left with questions that would never be fully answered. What truly drove Madeline to betray her husband and risk everything for Ryan? Was it love? Thrill? Or simply an escape from the emptiness that had consumed her? And what about Ethan? Had he ignored the warning signs, too focused on his own failures to see the cracks in their relationship? For those involved, the answers didn't matter anymore. What remained were broken lives, shattered dreams, and the grim realization that the pursuit of perfection could lead to destruction. As the years passed, the Carter story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that beneath the surface of even the most idyllic lives, turmoil could lurk, ready to tear everything apart. The Carter story didn't fade from public memory. It lingered, not just as a headline or a local scandal, but as a cautionary tale about the fragility of human relationships and the devastating power of unchecked ambition, betrayal, and deceit. Beneath its layers of scandal and tragedy lay deeper truths that many were too afraid to confront in their own lives. At its core, the story of Madeline and Ethan Carter was about the pursuit of perfection. Madeline had spent her life chasing an ideal, a picture-perfect life of luxury, adoration, and stability that she thought would shield her from the chaos of her past. Ethan, on the other hand, had been chasing a different kind of perfection, the need to prove himself, to his family and to the world, that he was a success worth celebrating. But perfection is a dangerous illusion. It demands sacrifices that strip away the humanity of those who pursue it. For Madeline, the sacrifices meant abandoning her sense of purpose and identity in the name of supporting her husband's dream. For Ethan, it meant losing sight of the very person he was building that dream for. Both became prisoners of their own aspirations, blind to the cracks forming in their foundation until it was too late. The Carter home, a beacon of success and stability, became a symbol of the cost of that pursuit. What was once a sanctuary became a battleground. And in the end, it was left empty, a hollow shell of what they had tried so hard to create. Madeline's affair with Ryan Miles wasn't just about lust or thrill, it was about escape. In Ryan, she found a temporary reprieve from the suffocating reality of her life. But escapism, no matter how alluring, is a dangerous path. It doesn't solve problems, it amplifies them. Ryan wasn't just an escape, he was a mirror reflecting Madeline's deepest fears and desires. In her desperation to feel alive, she ignored the red flags, allowing his darkness to intertwine with her own. By the time she realized the danger, she was in too deep to pull away. Her choices weren't made in a vacuum, but they had far-reaching consequences. Ethan's near death, Officer Hayes's tragic loss, and the ripple effect on their community all stemmed from the moment Madeline chose to prioritize her own escape over confronting her reality. The Carter marriage was not doomed by a single event but by a series of missed opportunities to communicate and rebuild trust. Both Madeline and Ethan were complicit in their own ways, she, by allowing resentment to fester, he, by failing to see her growing isolation. Their story serves as a reminder of how critical honesty and empathy are in any relationship. The inability to address their struggles together created a void that was filled with lies, betrayal, and ultimately violence. The Carter story raises profound questions that resonate far beyond the walls of their home. 1. At what point do ambition and the pursuit of happiness become destructive? 2. Could Ethan and Madeline have saved their marriage if they had faced their struggles together? 3. How far would you go to escape a life that feels suffocating? 4. Was Madeline a villain, a victim, or both? 5. What does this story teach us about the illusions we create to protect ourselves from reality? The tragedy of the Carters isn't just their downfall, it's the lessons left behind for us to learn from. Their story compels us to look inward and ask ourselves difficult questions about our own lives, relationships, and choices. What about you? Have you ever felt trapped by your own ambitions or expectations? Do you think Madeline's actions were justified in any way, or was her fate inevitable? Could Ethan have done more to prevent their marriage from crumbling? We want to hear from you. What do you think was the turning point in this story? Who do you believe is most at fault, Madeline, Ethan, or Ryan? If you were in Madeline's position, what would you have done differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories and thought-provoking discussions. Your voice matters, let's keep the conversation going.